Okay, well, perhaps we'll make a start. So if I could welcome you very warmly to this webinar. My name is Carol Atkinson, and I'm here on behalf of the CIPD Manchester branch, and my role in the branch is to lead the Fellows Forum. So this is a joint event between the Fellows Forum and Alliance Manchester Business School, so AMBS. And we do these events a couple of times a year, first time actually in a little while. But what we aim to do through these events is to bring you the latest research, but in a way that is very topical. So we're looking at navigating flexibility today, which is clearly very topical, but also in a way that is meaningful in terms of your everyday working lives and practice. So we're going to have some talks on the subjects, but we're also going to have some breakout rooms whereby we can explore some of the issues and themes that come up. So just first, before we do that, to introduce Professor Jill Rubery and Professor Emma Banister, who are both professors in the Institute of Work and Equalities at AMBS. And I'm going to leave them to introduce themselves in a little more detail. But just to say that the Work and Equalities Institute is recognised across the world as being leading in the field of employment research and in this particular topic, flexibility and navigating flexibility. So I'm sure we're in for a great session with some really interesting and thought-provoking material. Just so that you know what we're going to do, very shortly I'm going to finish my introduction and hand over to Jill and Emma, who are going to introduce themselves and the work they do generally. Jill is going to speak then for probably around 20 minutes on flexibility and COVID-19 before, during and after. And we might have some interactive work and some polls during that. But then we're going to break out into breakout rooms, and we have a series of questions that we're going to pose to you, and you can choose which of those you answer, if any. We're going to spend about 20 minutes in the breakout rooms, then we will come back. We aren't going to do an exhaustive round robin because there's quite a lot of people expected to attend, and that will not necessarily the most interesting way of dealing with the topic, but we will ask for any thoughts and observations and queries at the end. So if people particularly want to raise topics or ask questions, that will be very welcome. I'll do a few closing remarks and we will finish by 7:30. So that is our running order. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jill and Emma to take us through the session. Thank you both.
Thanks, Carol. I'll put this slide up that's been kept prepared so you can see our names and something about us. I'll start off and then hand over to Emma. I'm Professor Jill Rubery. I'm the director of the Work and Equalities Institute. I've been at Alliance Manchester Business School for several decades, and I've been doing a lot of work on issues around work and equalities, not only in the UK, but particularly across Europe. And I might bring in a few examples from there too. My main interests are in employment policies and practices and how they compare across countries, and a particular interest in gender equality. And obviously this topic feeds into that very well. But I'll hand over then to Emma for her to introduce herself.
Thanks, Jill. Hello, I'm Emma. My background's quite removed from HR and employment. In fact, most of my research has been focused on consumption and consumers. But within this focus, I've done quite a bit of work on motherhood and more recently fatherhood. So it's my work on fatherhood and specifically fathers who have taken shared parental leave that has got me more interested in flexible working. Along with my colleague Ben Crane from Manchester Metropolitan University, I've carried out research into the lived experiences of men who have taken periods of SPL. This work is longitudinal, so it's captured fathers' experiences both of leave itself and their return to work. There's also been various offshoots of this work. So we've done some work with working families and produced a series of videos, which you can find on their website if that interests you. And that includes kind of tips for employers in terms of shared parental leave policies and again sort of captures the kind of lived experiences of couples who've taken shared parental leave. And at the moment I'm working with working families again, but this time focusing on SMEs, because as you'll know, the kind of sort of various challenges connected with flexible working and with kind of different family friendly policies is very different for SMEs. They face different kinds of challenges. So we're looking at identifying good practice within that study. So while this session is focused on flexible working more generally, one of the things that immediately struck us with the work that we did on fathers was how many of the fathers in our study, after taking a period of leave at home with their children, actually sort of requested flexible working and specifically part-time working when they returned to work. So obviously I'm not going to go into detail now, but if that's something that interests people, we can talk about that a little bit in the discussion. So I think the interesting thing from my point of view is, while the work I've done is very small sample, it kind of sort of suggests that that sort of time at home as a primary carer does influence how fathers, how couples kind of see the kind of sort of caring, flexible working and things splitting, divided up between the couple. And I think that's really relevant when we think about COVID and this kind of enforced working from home and the kind of impact that could have on parents. So I'll pass you back to Jill now for the presentation.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Emma, and we'll let's move on. Yeah, I mean, I divided the presentation up into these sort of three phases, because obviously we entered COVID pandemic and suddenly had to have this major experiment in flexible working from home. And as we'll see, that prior to COVID, although there was some flexible working, it was really quite limited. So we need to look at what was happening then and what the policies and practices we had before COVID. We've now been going through this major experiment, but now that the vaccine is, if you like, on the horizon, I'm sure that HR managers are beginning to think about what does the future hold for flexible working? What are we going to say to our staff about whether they have to come back to work? Do they have to come back work full time? Do they have to come work back on some days a week? How are we going to manage to have face-to-face meetings if everybody's working flexibly? All these issues must be at the forefront of people's minds at the moment, because it's unclear. It's unclear to us, even in university, where we do work at home quite a lot, but are we going to have all our meetings now by Zoom, because it actually makes life a lot easier to coordinate? Or are we going to go back to a lot of face-to-face meetings and having to coordinate over the problem that people come in on different days, have teaching on different days, and actually finding a common day is actually quite complicated? Or can we find a hybrid? So that's the background to the three phases. And I'll start first of all with the flexible working before COVID. And I've actually called it a double-edged sword, because and that's really mainly from the perspective of employees rather than the managers. So it's quite surprising that actually there was, before COVID, a very small percentage of employees, less than 6%, were working primarily from home. And that had grown from, over decades, from about 2 or 3% to 6%, a very, very slow growth, despite previous periods when there's been a lot of talk about flexible working. You all know that in 2003, there was a right to request flexible working introduced. And flexible working can be, how you arrange your hours or the number of hours or whatever. And that has had positive benefits, it's clear in the research, particularly for women. Because before the flexible working right was introduced, it was even more common than it is today that people felt pressured when returning to work with a young child to give up their career job, because they didn't have the right to request to stay in the same job and reduce their hours or flex their hours. And most employers were not necessarily offering those opportunities. But the problem was that the consequence of giving up their career job that was sort of organised on a full-time basis to find a part-time job had major consequences for their whole life course. There's a lot of research that showed that many women downgraded the occupation in which they were employed in order to find a job offering part-time hours from the start. So this is a major problem for one of the reasons why women's careers really take a tumble, if you like, after having children, is having to change employers and change jobs. And so very few, if you like, high-level or high-paid jobs offer part-time hours or flexible hours from the start. Obviously, in the first instance, when flexible working was only really available for people carers of young children or sick adults, this did primarily affect women. There has been a widening criteria beyond those care responsibility, in fact, allowing anybody to apply for flexible working on the grounds that everybody has the objective of trying to reconcile their work and life objectives. But I think it's still the case that it's primarily women who request and who receive rights to work flexibly under the flexible working regulations. Now, I've said it's primarily been a benefit for women, but I think you could say there's also a benefit for employers, and possibly the shock of the COVID pandemic and everybody moving from home would have been greater if there hadn't been this experiment with flexible working. The first benefit is obviously the opportunity to retain staff. And one hopes that that is having a positive effect on recruiting, if you like, women into roles as well. And if there's a feeling that if flexibility is granted to enable people to come back to work, they won't have such a turnover associated with childcare. It also, as I've suggested already, provides an opportunity to experiment with flexible working, because employers really, I think, haven't really known how to deal with requests for flexible working. But if they felt, if you like, under some kind of greater moral pressure to offer flexible working, they had at least to find out whether it worked from their point of view. And this might help to overcome what I've called some kind of prejudices that it wouldn't work and would have major negative productivity effects. But we'll come back and discuss those later, in the different stages about whether or not that has been your experience under the COVID pandemic or not, that it's been productive or not productive. So now those are the positive sides for both the employees and the employer's point of view, but there's also been some potential negative aspects for employees. The first is that actually having the right to request requires, first of all, 26 weeks of continuous employment with one employer. And often that might have to be, if it's in if you like, a career type job, as a full-time employee. And that clearly reduces the effectiveness of this right to request as an equality strategy, because if the people who want to join an organisation already have children and already need to work flexibly and perhaps have that right with their existing employer, they can't, if you like, port that right to the new employer. They can't say to the new employer, you know, I have the right to request to work flexibly. In fact, they don't. They have to work another 26 weeks before they have a new right to request to work flexibly. And I think this means that there's a problem of women getting trapped with one employer who may not be offering them the opportunities that they want to progress their career. So yes, they want to work flexibly and maybe they want to reduce hours, at least for a time, but they don't necessarily want to give up on their career. But having, if you like, requested to work flexibly, they might find themselves trapped onto what's called in some of the literature a mommy track, where it's mainly mothers of young children who are working part-time and who are given specific types of jobs to do, or not thought about when it comes to training, promotion, opportunities. And this means that they don't have the opportunity to progress their career that they might want. It's also the case that not all organisations have granted these requests. It's more common in the public sector for the organisations both to receive requests and for them to grant them. There are quite a lot of stories about how, particularly in the private sector, but it could happen in the public sector too, requests are granted, but subject to conditions. one organisation that's renowned for that was the BBC, which if you were a full-time reporter on the BBC and you wanted to go part-time, you were asked to become freelance and set up your own company. There's many examples of people who request to go part-time who are told then that actually the only option is to take a 0-hour contract or a minimum hours contract. Because the employer says, well, I want some flexibility back. You want flexibility, but I don't want to guarantee, you know, half-time working. I want to guarantee 1 day a week. And if there's work, I'll employ you for more, but I won't otherwise. So these requests can come with rather negative conditions. There's also a problem that's been picked up in the research that although men are clearly eligible to request flexible working, many men do not feel they're actually entitled to request. They don't feel it's something that's been targeted at them, and they feel that it might be considered strange if they were to ask for flexible working. And that's where Emma's research on how having experienced shared parental leave might change those attitudes. But it may be also down to how organisations deal with those requests and whether they feel that it's appropriate for men to make those requests too. Now, compared to other European countries that have rights to either rights to work part-time, ours is a right to request, but in some European countries you have a right to work part-time, particularly if you have care needs. And you may also have the right either to return to full-time working or a right to request to return. For example, I think it's in France, you can request to be considered for any vacancies for full-time work that come up. Now that has never been part of the UK policy. So once you've opted for flexible working, you are in a category of a flexible part-time worker. Now, obviously organisations can take a different approach and can offer full-time working, but it's not part of our regulatory system. Another issue, and I'll be interested to hear from you, what's actually happened in your organisations, but I was never absolutely convinced that it was a good idea from the point of view, at least of gender equality, for this right to request flexible working to be extended to everybody. And the reason for that is I thought that given it's not a right, it's just a right to request, that it might actually make it very difficult for employers to decide how to deal with all the different requests, whether they would consider it potentially discriminatory if they said, we'll only give it to people who've got young children, or we'll only give it to people who've been here 5 years, or we'll, whatever they came up with, it might be seen as not fair. And I thought that it might encourage people to say it's just too difficult and we won't sort of do it. So those are some of my concerns, but I haven't actually got any empirical evidence on the latter point. It just struck me as something that made it slightly less likely that those with very immediate caring needs, particularly very young children, might be not at the top of the queue for these flexible working requests, and that might be a problem. So I think we have a poll now. Is this happening? Yes, here we are. So the poll question that you're encouraged to answer is, how would you rate your employees' productivity during periods of remote working under the COVID-19 lockdown? That's the bit we're going to go on to discuss next. So if I'm not quite certain here whether I'm managing this poll or not, but
don't worry, Jill, I'm in charge.
Right, good.
Just going to give it a couple more seconds. So if you've not voted and you wish to.
There's a message saying we can't see the poll. I don't know whether that's just one person or lots of people.
So I've had
I can see it. Oh, right, okay.
I think it's a button at the bottom on people's screens. Right. You need to click on the poll button.
71% voted, so I am going to end polling now.
Right.
I'll share the results with you.
So we've got 13% worse than usual, that's the lowest. 37% same as usual, that's 50%. 40% better than usual, and 10% don't know. Well, that's actually quite common, isn't it? That people actually don't know about productivity. It's quite a difficult thing to measure and manage. But so that's very honest. But okay, so I think we'll see that that's possibly better than the survey results I'll present to you in a minute. Yeah. Okay, should we go on? Does this, do I just carry on?
That's fine. Hopefully
No, you need to take the poll, the slide's not moving.
Can you try it again?
Try it again. No, should I turn the poll, close the poll?
I've closed the poll. Maybe you need to close it on your screen.
Yeah, I did. Oh.
Press enter maybe? If not.
Interesting.
Get the slides up.
There we go.
Oh, there we go.
Got it.
Perfect.
Okay, right. Flexible working under COVID. So suddenly in March, we all had to work from home, and it's amazing how necessity is the mother of innovation, as the saying goes. So as I've already said, only less than 6% were working mainly from home before COVID, but it rose 8-fold according to a research survey, from 5.7% to 43% by April, and then declined again a bit by June when people could start to return to work. So it became very normal for office workers to work from home. There's a bit of variation in the survey estimates about whether it was mainly men or mainly women who were able to work from, or likely to work from home. I think we can just say that it was fairly even. I think the important thing here is that this experiment, however, came alongside school closures in the early period. And that clearly has had divergent impacts on men and women, and of course on mothers and fathers versus non-mothers and fathers. I'll show you some data in a minute, but women, the results of various surveys suggest that women did more of the additional caring and reduced their wage work hours more than men. But the outcome was that they increased their total hours of work a bit more. Now, that's not all bad news because for gender equality, because at the same time, men who were working from home did increase their caring hours by a higher percentage than for women, but obviously from a lower base. So it still means that women did more, but men increased their caring, if you like, by a bit more, by a higher percentage. They also managed to do more paid work hours, and importantly, their work was less interrupted than was the case for mothers. One of the interesting findings I'll show you in a minute was that if men lost their jobs and were therefore not working, women still did a high share of the care. But if women lost their jobs, the reverse was not the same. And we've heard a lot about how good the policies have been in the UK supporting people during the first lockdown, and I would agree that the furlough scheme was very successful and supported a lot of people and was roughly of the same order of magnitude as most European countries, if not, you know, at the generous end. But what was lacking in the UK, and I think this is just something that people aren't discussing very much, but I think it's still relevant today, because of school closures, is that there was no specific support for parents. You could request to be furloughed if you had children to homeschool, but no right to be furloughed, so it was up to employers. But in 20 of the European countries, and this relates to some research I've been doing, there was a right to special parental leave. Now, it wasn't ideal in all cases, it was sometimes a bit low paid, and sometimes you still had to get your employer permission to take it, but not in 16 cases, you just had an absolute right to parental leave. But I don't know how many people know this, but I was just reading something I suspected, but I was reading newspaper articles about it. The £500 support for self-isolating is not available to parents who are having to self-isolate because their children are self-isolating. So the UK is continuing to actually rather ignore the issue of how do you work from home if you've got your children around, even if you can in principle work from home. So the assumption was if if you could work from home, it didn't really matter that your kids were there, you could still work from home. So as we've in the poll, there's this mixed the research suggests there is mixed views on the productivity effects, on generally fairly positive. 40% no change, 30% it increased, and 30% it decreased. So as I say, your figures are slightly better than that. You only had, I think, 13% decrease. Anyway, that's very much in line. And obviously, something you may want to discuss in detail, all of this involved new forms of management and monitoring. That is something that I haven't really found much evidence, systematic evidence about how that's been done. And I think that's something that we'll need to research in the future. So just to show you a few data that this data comes from Institute for Fiscal Studies, who did an early study. And what you can see in these is mothers at the top and fathers below. And it compares 2014-15 to what was happening in April 2020. And the green bars are uninterrupted work and the yellow bars are interrupted work. And I think you can see, so we take the mothers to start with, that there was a major collapse in the uninterrupted work and an extension of the interrupted work and overall lower hours of paid work. For men too, there was a reduction in the hours of work, and obviously the women working fewer beforehand in 2014-15 too. But you can see, I think, that the reduction in the uninterrupted hours was much less for men, and in fact the number of hours that were interrupted remained roughly the same. So you can see there the effects that women had to reduce their hours of work more and suffered more interruptions. We can make these slides available to you, by the way, if anybody's interested, because I know I'm going fairly fast through these. Then this slide, this is among those working by whether they work at home or outside the home. Now, if they're working outside the home, you can see that fathers did a lot less childcare than mothers. If you look, the home is in the working at home, both parents working at home is in the bottom part of the diagram. And you can see childcare, the gap between the childcare hours put in by fathers and mothers is much reduced when both are working from home. So women still did the childcare if they went outside the house, but fathers did more if they were both at home. And there wasn't much variation in housework or in the paid work is something similar to what we saw before. And then we have this third slide, which is time used by who is still working for couples who are both in paid work in February, but then one lost their job. And again, so if the father's only the father is working, you can see in that top two bars, the dark green is the father's childcare and the light green is the mother's, how much more childcare the mother does. If the mother is the only one working, the father is not working, the father steps up. You can see that in the childcare in the second half of the figure, and does slightly more than the mothers, but you can see the big gap. The mothers don't reduce their childcare that much, so it's a very different picture if it's the mother who's the only one, the one who's not working, and then if it's the father who's not working. And you can see that, I mean, there is a bit more housework done, but it's not very significant. And here's the productivity effects. We've talked about that already. You can see that there weren't very many where much less work was done, and fewer than the share where much more work was done, with most focusing around the same amount of work was done. Okay, we're back to a next poll. So this question is your organisation considering making any longer term changes to the use of remote working after the COVID-19 lockdown? I think this will be an easy one to know where we're getting the highest score.
So we've got about 60 people, 70% now voted, so just give it a couple more seconds. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now.
So 81% is allowing more remote working, 6% is moving entirely to remote working. That's, I don't know, is that just one person?
Two people.
Two people, right? And neither is 13%. Okay, so most people are moving towards more or entirely remote working. So the future really matters. So I'm going to close that to see if that helps me move my slides on. Yep. Fabulous. Okay, so on to the third part, which is really what I'm sure we really want to discuss, and that's the future for flexible working. Now, it's no longer possible for employers to say it cannot work. A lot of employers will end up spending almost a year with most of their office workers working from home. So either their business is really going down the tubes, or it can work in some way. Now let's look at the benefits and then the problems. The benefits of new flexible working for employees is, first of all, I think that this may mean that there will be opportunity flexibility from the point of hire, rather than that 26 weeks having to work in regular full-time employment before you can even request working flexibly. And that would help the end of the entrapment of flexible workers with a single employer who might not be looking after your best interests and not providing with opportunities. It's also an opportunity, and this links to Emma's research, for fathers to be more involved in childcare. It could be, if you like, an alternative to the shared parental leave, in the sense that even if fathers don't take shared parental leave, they may, by virtue of doing more flexible working, may actually experience something similar, that they actually become more involved in the home, and it has a cumulative impact. There's obviously the reduced commuting time and the costs of commuting, and the fact that it's easier to integrate work and life because you're in the same place, and you don't have to keep coordinating where you are and traveling. I think a major improvement is the reduced business travel and how much easier it is to arrange meetings, because I think that's always been a bit of a challenge in high-level jobs for women anyway, to having to go to travel for meetings, and how those don't fit with your regular, if you like, arrangements for care. There's also probably reduced sick leave. You could probably carry on working a little bit, keeping things ticking along, and prefer to do that rather than come back to work to everything sitting at your desk, just because you haven't felt like actually going out the house. You haven't been, completely unable to work. And also there's opportunities in a way to combine work and care over key periods like school holidays and half term and things, particularly with older children who may be happy to entertain themselves but can't be left entirely on their own. And then the benefits of flexible working for employers, well, these could be very significant. Reduced need for office space, very expensive. You might find that you have a less stressed and more productive workforce. It can enable sort of rapid formation of project work and new and diverse teams without, it can just be done remotely without any movement between offices or buildings or whatever. And if people feel the need to move for family or other reasons, you might be able to keep those staff and say, well, we may still want you to come into the office sometimes, but as you can do some of your work remotely, it may not be a make or break reason for staying with the organisation or not. And it may be possible to increase the monitoring of productivity that you weren't able to do in a general office, if that was a problem. And certainly you may feel that you can actually contain, if you like, the amount of productivity loss from what I've called coffee machine socializing here. I've said this as a possible benefit. I recognize there may be also losses from this. And what you can see here is this is the percentage of those who have been working at home under the first lockdown who would like in the future to work from home or not. So 11.8% never want to work at home, so a fairly small percentage. 40.9% sometimes want to work at home, but 34.1% want to often work at home, and 13.2% always work at home. So there's nearly 50% want to often or always work at home, and only less than 12% never want to work from home. So we're having another poll here. So the question here was, do you think there'll be more interest among your male employees in working flexibly or remotely following COVID-19? Again, a fairly clear-cut winner, yes. With 83%, only 3% no, and 14% don't know, which is fair enough. So have we closed the poll? Yeah. Okay. And I think what's happened now? Why won't it move? Let me try and, yeah, there we are. So let's think about the future for flexible working. There are some issues for employees. I think there's a major risk that it's men who mainly do the returning to the office with women working from home, and there's a danger of new forms of segregation between men and women forming, and problems for how you develop and promote those people who are mainly working at home. These are just my risk, a whole series of issues to consider. There's a risk of long working hours or possibly higher work intensity, depending on how work is monitored. I mean, if it's monitored by results, what you actually manage to get done and your achievements, that may lead to long working hours. If it's based on logged on time, it may result in higher work intensity because you may not have the breaks that you have at work, as I say, the coffee machine socializing, and that may lead to burnout possibly and other problems. There's the risks of privacy at home. You might want to think about that, how, whether people being monitored on their home computers or whatever. I think there's a risk of reduced commitment by the organisation longer term to those people who are working mainly from home. It might encourage the use of intermediaries or platforms to employ and manage those staff, and that may mean that people are no longer really linked to an organisation and become much more or they feel much less sort of involved in the organisation. And I think at the home level, there may be pressure for people to stop using nurseries and childcare and just assume, like the government has done, that it's possible to work from home while your children are there. I don't know that that has happened, but if you're pushed for on your budgets, which many people will be after COVID, there is, expensive childcare may be seen as a bit of a luxury if the mother's at home anyway. So we have to think about that. And of course, childcare infrastructure may be less available because many of the childcare providers have had a bad time under COVID and may have closed. And one thing that's not necessarily fully recognised is there are variations in how people, both men and women, like to organise their work and life. There is strong evidence that there are some people really prefer segregation with strong borders between their work and their other parts of their life, and others like to juggle and integrate because it's easier. So it's not going to suit everybody to work from home if you've got a lot of care responsibilities there as well. And I think we have to remember that particularly women who were, if you like, confined largely to the house in the 50s and 60s, there was a major desire for people to move out of the home into the more public space and leave the house. And there is a danger that that opportunity will be denied. And finally, I think this is my final slide. There are issues for employers. I worry that productivity under COVID might be artificially high from home working because most people had formed good relationships with their colleagues in the physical workplace. And you didn't have to start making those connections again, at least initially. And it may be quite difficult to induct new employees. And the commitment from employees may weaken over time to the organisation if that commitment is based on links to the physical workplace and personal relationships with colleagues. And there's also the challenge of how do you monitor productivity? It's clear that too much surveillance will undermine trust and may lead to a rather difficult relationships. But it's also clear that you may lose sort of any control or knowledge of what's happening in the organ, to, you know, what the pace of work, whether people are really getting on with work, and whether or not you can actually sort of plan and meet deadlines and things like that that are important for businesses. And I think the reinforcement of the gender divide is really problematic, particularly if you're trying to meet gender equality objectives. But it's also difficult to how to maintain engagement and motivation across segregated workplaces. It might not work in the medium to long term. So those are some of the issues that I'm raising. And I think we can probably end my, well, no, we're not going to end my slides because I've got the slides for the breakout session. Sorry, I think that took longer than I was expecting, but we can see whether there are any questions for us in the chat, or if you want to raise some questions now before we go into the breakout rooms, that is.
I think that was really great. Thank you, Jill. Should we just see if there's any in the chat then, and then if anybody's got any, they can sort of raise their hands as well.
I've seen Patricia has put a question. I don't know whether Patricia wants to say the question herself.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Patricia.
Okay, this is Patricia. Thank you very much for this presentation. I've also been working in surveys. I work in tech, actually, and I've been surveyed the population regarding the impact of unpaid work. And I'm curious about the data you presented. What is the size of the population you surveyed?
Sorry, I didn't outline this. They're not my surveys. I was referring to the first set of data came from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, which you've probably heard of, is one of the leading think tanks, leading sort of organizations that do government assessments of government policy. And they did a big, I'm sorry, I think it was about 2000 or something. It was early in April. The other surveys, the one by Felsted and Rushka, was based on the major Understanding Society survey that's used in the UK for really all issues about work and employment and social and family life. And that they did a rolling out period of month-by-month surveys to capture early on what was really going on. And it's the early phases of that have been reported on there. It's really the best we have, shall we say, of what's available.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, there's another question come up. It just on here, it just says my phone. I don't know if that person wants to ask their question themselves, or I can read it out. Okay, they say, good presentation. What do you say to employers who still feel you need to be in the office to make an impact on culture, and visibility is essential, particularly if you're new?
Well, shall I answer, and then Emma, you might have some views on this too.
I'll try and think.
I'm personally of the view that only working from home is not necessarily a good idea. You know, I hope it didn't come over that way. I was making a particular case for carrying on with working from home all the time for everybody. I think we would lose a great deal from that. That doesn't mean that you can't work from home some of the time and effectively. So I think being visible and making an impact is probably important. But we don't necessarily have to do that 5 days a week and commute at peak times. That would be my view, but I'm interested really to hear your experiences. I'm just reporting on the issues that are, sort of lie ahead for us and thinking about work and employment.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with you on that. I mean, I think it's challenging as an employee, and particularly if you were a new employee. And I know people, even say at Manchester, where we work, who had sort of started shortly before COVID, and how difficult that is to sort of form those relationships, not just with the space, but with your colleagues as well, purely over Zoom. I mean, it picks up on, I don't know if Alan Harding wanted to say anything about your point. I mean, it's not a question, but you've sort of mentioned coffee machine socializing. Did you want to say anything about that, Alan?
Yeah, it was just a comment, Emma, that a lot of my colleagues, you know, we have a fairly open office system. It's open plan, you don't book seats, so there's lots of interaction at the workplace, which has just completely disappeared. And my personal feeling is that, you know, useful though these technologies that we're now basing our lives around are, it's no sort of replacement for that. So, you know, that casual chat, making a cup of tea, saying, what on earth is this about? You know, and I really do think it's divided the workforce into silos in a way that didn't happen before, and not very productively, I would argue. You know, there are decisions being made now which would have been subject to more challenge previously. Partly that's COVID. We're all running 1,000 miles an hour, and we feel the need to be seen to be doing something. So it's, you know, you're not comparing like with like in a sense, but I do think those, you know, if we're gonna continue to rely on technology quite as much as we are doing now, we need to come up with better virtual ways of having those casual interactions and making the quality of decision making as good as it used to be.
I would agree with that. No. The corridor conversations is what's lacking, isn't it? Yeah.
Thank you. So we thought it'd be nice for you to have a chance to talk to each other in smaller groups, and also talk about your own experiences, really, anyway. So we're going to move you into Zoom rooms shortly, and we've got 3 questions that I think will kind of come into the rooms with you. And you don't have to, you know, don't feel restricted to this. This is just to maybe simulate a bit of discussion if you want to. So you can answer one, all of them, none of them, whatever you want to do. So first of all, we thought it might be interesting for you to sort of talk about how COVID has impacted your organisation's approach to flexible working. So particularly maybe thinking, is there anything that particularly surprised you during this period? So things like we've just talked about, you know, the sort of lack of the sort of coffee machine discussions and the kind of wider impact that's had, those kinds of things. Are there particular aspects that you know, within this that you will impact your understanding of flexible working going forward, really? So really reflecting on this period of COVID and flexible working. Secondly, Jill's mentioned a few times the kinds of the differences that males and females have, the different challenges that they face during this period, whether it be to do with family, other care responsibilities, or there might be other things that you've noticed. So whether you've sort of noticed those kind of differences within your organisation. And you might want to think, again, we asked you in the poll about whether you expect to see more requests from male employees going forward. And loads of you, I wrote it down somewhere, I think it was 81%, was it 81%? 83% thought you're more likely to get requests from men. So kind of thinking about how the sort of impact that might have. And maybe thinking about, are they making requests, or are they likely to make requests for different reasons as well? And lastly, what will be your organisation's approach to flexible working, including remote working post-COVID? And we've seen some signs of that already in terms of your poll results. And obviously all these questions are kind of interlinked, but you might find that you want to focus more on one than the other. So I think Rebecca's going to put you into rooms, and I think we've got around about 20 minutes for you within your rooms. I think that works for time, doesn't it, Carol? I think so. She's nodded. So, and then we'll come back for a bit of a discussion. And don't worry, we're not going to pick on any of you and say you have to feed back. We're not going to do that. But if people have things that they want to bring back to the group from your room, that would be really, really helpful as well. Thank you.
So as you can tell, those of you who are returning to the room, we're discussing the challenges of working at home and the noise levels. My dogs just went, so I apologise. So welcome back. I hope you had some fruitful discussions. And I wondered if you wanted to reflect any of those back to us. There's no pressure. We'll pick up some questions from the chat if you don't. But is there anything particular that anybody wants to share or discuss, or indeed ask of Jill or Emma? Well, shall we start while you think about that by just going back to a couple of questions? So Jill and Emma, there was a question about what did we think would be the implications of returning to work for flexibility, and is there likely to be a loss of flexibility at that point?
One of the things sorry. Go on,
you go ahead, Emma. Yeah, I'm thinking.
I was just going to say, one of the things I think will be, I haven't particularly got answers, but one of the things I think is quite interesting is how sort of sudden it was that everybody had to sort of work from home, well, unless they were key workers or whatever, and whether there'll be any kind of reining in on that sort of, you know, you weren't able to kind of necessarily consider how you're going to manage things. So, for example, we talked about the, you know, the water cooler and sort of the good things about having a workspace and the chit chat that goes on, and there wasn't that opportunity to really think, how are we going to manage this? So people slipped into particular habits, and how, you know, whether workplaces will have to make sort of decisions on more sort of managing that, perhaps talking to sort of line managers about their teams and things like that. So I think that would be quite interesting, maybe.
Yeah, that will. Jill, did you want to?
Well, I think it's difficult to predict, isn't it? Because you know, we really don't know whether there's going to be suddenly a sort of an announcement, everybody can go back to work, and organisations are all going to respond to that, or whether it's going to be staged. I mean, I just take the university. We were going through a period of staged return, but we had to nominate 2 days that when we would go back into the office, so that they could, you know, spread out how many people were in the building. But I sort of nominated 2 days with no idea whether they were the right days or anything. So it's actually, again, quite tricky to sort of move to a sort of half opening. It would be easier to move back to full opening, I think, in many respects, because it's incredibly difficult to plan what half opening might mean. I do wonder whether we're going to end up sitting in our offices having Zoom meetings with the people next door.
Yeah. And that occurs to me that when we're all there physically or all on Zoom, that's relatively easy to manage. But I wonder when you've got some there physically and some on Zoom, how that dynamic will work.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so the last
I think it's difficult to imagine, in other words. I think I'm struggling to work out what will happen, but
okay. And the final question was around women's careers and whether there was any evidence as yet of negative impact from COVID and home working.
I think there has been some evidence that women were more likely to be furloughed and more likely to lose their jobs. Although I have seen the more likely to be furloughed is a bit, the evidence in some surveys suggests that and others don't. I think there was also more evidence of women quitting because of the homeschooling issue. But it's still, I think that was probably still fairly small numbers compared to the problem of job loss due to redundancies and you know, the fact that hospitality and retail is really struggling, and this has been a major area of women's employment. So there will be a sectoral effect as well as, if you like, a homeschooling, home working, you know, kind of effect. What worries me, and I suppose why I've been talking a lot about the lack of parental leave and the lack of a discussion that people have the right to be, you know, to have leave if they're having to look after children, is that if I think and then coupled with the childcare collapse, it might be more difficult for women to actually you know, leave the house to go back to work, and that may mean that they actually, you know, labelled as unreliable and not as desirable as they were before COVID. So I think that is a worry. And I think we need to do something to shore up the childcare provision quite quickly before a lot of them close down.
Yeah, absolutely. Emma, any final thoughts before we move to round up?
Oh, no, I think that's fine. I think there is a rule. I mean, it always comes back to childcare, doesn't it? Unfortunately.
Yeah, it does. I think you have a final slide then, Jill, didn't you, with some of our closing messages?
Yes. I don't know why I'm having difficulties with this. There we go. Summary. Further support. Is it in there? There we go. Useful links. Oh, well, you could. Sorry, I went past this. Do you want me to go back to the further support? Let me do that. Do you want to say something about that, Carol? You were going to say people wanted further discussions and.
Yes, one of the things we were going to talk about, I was going to raise, was what part of the purpose of the CIPD is clearly to bring to you the kind of evidence and debates that we've had this evening. But it would also be interested from a CID's point of view to know things that you think we could do to help. So there might be some kind of particular research programs, there might be some particular outreach or resources that would be helpful, and we can feed that back to CIPD. So if you want to put anything in the chat, or if you want to contact us separately with anything that you think CIPD can usefully do to support you, then please do let us know. That'd be helpful. And then the final slide, I think, just while I'm on a roll, so that's our website, so the CIPD website generally, and for the Manchester branch. So you can find all our events and our contact details. As I say, do please be in touch if there's things that you think we can work on you with. And Jill.
And yes, those are the WEI stands for the Work and Equalities Institute, and so you can find our website there, and you can email us on this. I meant to actually say, I forgot in my introduction, I am actually an academic fellow of the CIPD. So so I get your emails about the branch and everything, but I'm afraid I haven't been attending. So yeah. So
now we're all on webinars, Jill, you'll be able to attend.
Yes, I know. Trouble is, there's quite a number of webinars at the moment. So but it was very nice that we had such a number of so many participants, and I hope we'll be able to do this again in the not too distant future with another topic.
Yes, well, so just to pick up on that, these are events that we do a couple of times a year, and the next topic, I have to confess I haven't got the date to hand, which is remiss of me. I don't know if Kieran is on the call still and does, but we will do something in March around artificial intelligence and HR, again with AMBS. The speakers still to be announced, but do look out for that, and you'll find the details of that in due course on that Manchester link. A few queries about slides and recordings, and I can confirm we will circulate slides and recordings, so all the information will be available to you. So at this point, really, it just remains for me to thank Jill and Emma for some really stimulating presentations and communications. I think we've all learned a lot from it. I certainly have, and I hope in your breakout rooms, I've seen a few comments about the breakout rooms that they were useful, so I hope they were good spaces for you to further your discussions. So again, many thanks to AMBS, to Jill, to Emma, and for Becky and Kieran for their organisation. And hopefully we'll see you again at the March event.